Counter War at least.
Yeah. And being able to resolve that show and tell is pretty important. And luckily, Jeremy can't punish him for resolving a show and tell, and then, not having a pact or something along those lines. So it looks like Jeremy is keeping his 7-card hand, but Bryan is mulliganing here down to 6,
right.
Which is something that happens a lot with combo decks, and this is a sort of combo deck that actually mulligans pretty well.
Well, it only requires 3 cards to win. You need a Hive Mind, a Show and Tell, and a Pact of some sort. You can also do just Show and Tell and Emrakul, which it also plays. So because of that, I think once it has 2 or all 3 pieces, basically it can even a 6-card hand can be very good.
Yeah, and so those sorts of like 2-card combo decks or 3-card combo decks tend to mulligan much better than the sort of combo decks like Storm that depend on getting a critical mass of resources. So it looks like we're both keeping after Bryan mulligans to 6. He starts off with a Scalding Tarn, and we're going to fetch probably a basic island, I'd imagine.
Yeah, at least in the dark, there's no reason for him to go for a dual land here, as long as he has another land in his hand. It's probably definitely best for him to be in the dark playing around wastelands.
Yep. So we're pondering. We've got another land. Looks like we've got 2 show and tells, and the Hive Mind. Okay, so we're just looking for packs here.
Right. And he does see he has an Ancient Tomb, but mana doesn't particularly seem to be the problem. How important would you say it is for him to keep 2nd copies of each of the show and tell? If you, at least right now, he doesn't know what his opponent's on. If he knew his opponent was on Bug Delver, how important is it for him to get redundancy in his hand?
So having redundant show and tells is not very effective, but certainly having redundant packs and Hive Minds is very useful.
So the reason you would never redundant show and tells is eventually, if you're against discard, you can just cast the spell?
Yes. The one thing that redundant show and tells gives you is it's a way to beat counter spells, because you can cast show and tell. If it gets countered, you don't fight over it, and then you cast show and tell again the next turn. And because it's not the actual thing that you're putting into play that gets countered, you get to repeat that process. So it's something that having the redundancy there is good if Jeremy has Force of Wills, but it's pretty bad if he's relying on counter spells.
All right, so Jeremy also fetching a basic. At this point, he still doesn't actually know what deck his opponent's on. His opponent could easily be on Rug Delver.
Yeah. And can we double check that we have the right deck list and the right person? I think that's not Jeremy Edwards, because the deck list I'm looking at doesn't actually have a forest.
Yeah,
it looks like a Jund deck to me. So if it is a Jund deck, then...
Well, certainly will change the matchup.
Yeah. So Bryan's going to be in much better shape if it is a Jund deck. Again, those...
Yeah, this is definitely Jund.
Yeah. So discard is the only thing he has to worry about, and the fact that Jeremy... and that's probably not Jeremy. I'm going to keep calling him Jeremy until we figure out who he actually is. Because he just has to worry about discard, and there wasn't discard played initially. It's John Edwards, not Jeremy Edwards.
Okay, so our apologies for those, especially to John there for getting. But all right, so we have this up. It is correct. John is playing Jund, not Bug Delver.
Yeah. So Bryan's pretty far ahead. He hasn't, like, you'd expect a discard spell to be played early. That hasn't happened. John clearly doesn't know what the matchup is because he's fetched double basic here. So that's not any failing of John's. He's being careful, but
What other decks could you put? I think you can start to put him on a deck. What kind of decks would just fetch for Island, Ponder, then play another fetch and say go? Like, it could theoretically happen out of Rug Delver, but that becomes very unlikely.
Doesn't run islands.
Yeah, it doesn't run a basic island.
And they're certainly not running polluted deltas. They're going to be all on Misty Rainforest and Scalding Tarns. And there actually isn't a need for that. But if you look at everybody,
if you're playing the net deck, it could still be that. I mean, Ancient Tomb, first of all, a dead giveaway that we're looking at a combo deck.
So when you see Fetch for Island and you see Ancient Tomb, then you should probably immediately be putting them on a show and tells, probably Sneak and Show. But if you recognize Bryan
Right.
Eleyet, you should put him on Hive Mind. He is
Until we
famous
saw
for this.
Ancient Tomb, it could have technically been High Tide even at this point.
Yeah, High Tide is an option. Some sort of Blue-White Miracles deck, a Stoneblade deck. There are options, but somebody fetching Basic Island on turn 1, you're probably not going to be running into a deck that runs Wasteland unless like it's some psychotic version of Stoneforge Mystic, or like Esper Stoneblade that is running 1 or 2 Wastelands. Well, you're not going to see any fetch lands out of Merfolk, so that's about the only option there.
So when we look at the weapons that John has in this matchup, he has 3 Thoughtseize, 1 Inquisition, he has 3 Hymn to Turox, and 4 Liliana of the Veil as his ways to interact. And this is ways to interact with Bryan's hand or combo. Outside of that, probably what John's looking for is somewhat of a fast clock, as I think given enough turns, John can't permanently stop, he can't permanently shut down the combo deck outside of Liliana.
Yeah. So looks like I actually misidentified things before. It wasn't Show and Tells that Bryan had. It was Intuition. So he's got a hand of Hive Mind, Intuition, and Grim Monolith, and Pact of Negation. And so he's going to be able to Intuition for Show and Tells here. Okay. So we also have a Wasteland on the Ancient Tomb. If we didn't have the Wasteland on the Ancient Tomb, Bryan could have actually won on the next turn by intuitioning for Show and Tells, then Show and Telling the Hive Mind into play. After the Hive Mind resolves, casting the Grim Monolith and Pact and negating it. That's not going to be possible right now, but Bryan is still in really good shape here. He's floated some mana, I believe, for to be able to play Intuition once John tries to pass the turn.
Right.
And that's what happens here. And I imagine he's just going to go get some Hive Minds.
Okay, so and at this point, there's no danger really to, he's then at that point binned 3 of his 4 Hive Minds. He's still a mana short for next turn for comboing.
I believe he's got another Ancient Tomb in hand.
Oh, if he has another Ancient Tomb.
So
he's
going to be a mana short for the next turn, but what he can do, like if he draws a blue spell, for example, he can spend mana on his turn to cast the Grim Monolith, setting up for the next turn.
Right. So how much? But there is a worry here. Then if John has another Thoughtseize, then Bryan will be out of Hive Minds.
That's not a super big worry. He's got the backup plan of Emrakul, and you can always get an Emrakul into your graveyard to reshuffle the Hive Minds to be able to Intuition for them again. So you're not like dead if he thought it's not good.
You have
for you.
It's not good for you, but there is a secondary plan.
Yeah, there are actually reasonable backup plans. So have we drawn for the turn? I think we've just untapped.
Right. So we're looking at upkeep, possible upkeep, but I'm not sure what his upkeep decision is.
Bryan may just be thinking through the turn.
Okay.
So drawing our card, and I think
City of Traders drawn.
Yeah, I think we're just going to see him play out. Well, actually, he might decide to wait 1 turn.
For Grim Monolith?
For the Grim Monolith to play around Abrupt Decay out of his opponent, but it turns out he's not.
Right, I mean, the reason he doesn't have to there is even if it does get Abrupt Decay, he'll still have 6 mana next turn thanks to the City of Traders he's just drawn.
Right, but because he has Pact of Negation in hand, he needs to draw a spell that he can cast the same turn that he casts Hive Mind. So he's kind of relying on like drawing a Brainstorm or a Ponder or something along those lines next turn. So having the extra mana is useful.
So what are the dangers of him running out a High Tide and then trying to, counter a spell, maybe hoping to draw a spell the following turn? Outside of, he certainly would then open to Maelstrom Pulse.
Yeah.
But outside of that, there's not too much direct enchantment removal that John would have.
Yeah, Maelstrom Pulse is the only card that John could have that would impact that place.
And that's a one of.
Yeah, if that. So in this particular case, it is a one of.
Right.
So let's see what John is up to. He's playing a Badlands for the turn, which is good for Bryan that he's not getting wastelanded. And I'd imagine this is a Bloodbraid Elf that we're going to see. Yep. So we've got a Bloodbraid Elf. We're going to spin the wheel. see whether we hit anything useful.
And Bloodbraid Elf into Thoughtseize I think is quite useful here.
Yeah, and so this is going to punish the intuition that we saw before. I still like the intuition play from Bryan. He knew that his opponent had just drawn the previous Thoughtseize because he didn't lead with Thoughtseize. He didn't do anything on turn 1. So like it's a very good read, rather, that your opponent doesn't have a Thoughtseize and probably doesn't have a Hymn based on the way they fetched. So I think it's a very reasonable, defensible play. And Bryan is now going to have to, go back to the Emrakul plan, which is going to take a little work to do and maybe difficult.
He's looking at Pact and Negationing here because he is able to pay for it on the next upkeep, which is a pretty.
That's a good heads-up
reasonable
play. So Bryan's going to spend the next turn paying for the Pact. It's going to tap his Grim Monolith, but it's going to be easier to rebuild and find another
Well,
Pact.
I mean, his option here is that if he packs, then he just has to. If he packs with negation, this means he only has to. This means he only has to find another Pact, of which he has 7 more in the deck.
Yeah.
The other line means he'd have to find a Show and Tell and an Emrakul, which, given how the board looks, seems unlikely to be able to find that before being beaten by Bloodbraid Elf and Deathrite Shaman together.
Yeah. No, Bryan's play is definitely the correct one. So Bryan is taking this attack from Bloodbraid Elf, is fetching, getting a Volcanic Island, which... Well, let's see, does he have anything main deck that's actually going to push for that?
What are you looking for?
Just looking to see... So he could have fetched for a basic island, which I think is probably
why he's choosing to get a dual land instead of that.
So like getting the Volcanic Island means that he could pay for his own Pact of the Titan, but I think that's the only thing in the main deck that he would want red for. And honestly, like it seems a little risky to open yourself up to Wasteland there. That said, like you're already a
I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why it would be that instead of an island.
So we pay for the Pact, pass the turn back to John.
So Bryan Eleyet's hand now 2 cards, I believe. One, a Hive Mind, and then an Unknown.
Yeah, the card he drew for the turn. And the next turn he is simply going to play the Hive Mind.
And he's drawn another Pact.
So
as long as if he can draw another spell, he'll get to untap next turn with. All right, he gets Inquisition of Kozilek.
Which is going to take an attack.
Yeah,
which is fine.
It's untap with 9 mana next turn. I mean, he essentially just has to let that happen.
Yep. So next turn he's going to play the Pact to negate, or he's going to pay the hard cast the Hive Mind.
Yeah, so John, with another Bloodbraid Elf here, now has Bryan down on a 2-turn clock, or what is presumably a 2-turn clock. Yeah. So we have 6 here.
6 here.
And then next turn should be lethal. So Bryan has a lot of work to do if he wants to try to pull off this Hive Mind.
Bryan needs to draw exactly Pact of the Titan or Brainstorm into land Pact of the Titan.
It doesn't necessarily have to be into a land even. You can
sorry.
Grim Monolith is not going to do it. John should be able to take game 1 here. And Bryan knows it. So John Edwards, a timely cascade there for the Thoughtseize, and then following it up with an Inquisition, able to keep the Hive Mind off, not Hive Mind off the table, but basically all the Pacts and all the second halves of the combo off the table.
Yep, and you can see sort of the resiliency of the Hive Mind deck here. There was a lot of disruption. Things went very wrong for Bryan, and he still almost won that game. He was going to be able to cast the Hive Mind on that turn, and if the multiple disruption spells from John, if John had only had 2 discard spells instead of 3, Bryan would have won that.
Right.
So, shall we take a look at sideboards?
Well, in the sideboard, so as opposed to when we were kind of discussing it before, the Jund deck does have a lot of very good sideboarding options. He has in his board another Inquisition, 2 Duresses, and a possibility to board into Surgical Extraction, which I think he probably has enough dead cards in this matchup that we'll see all of those come in.
Yeah, so we're definitely going to want to take out the Abrupt Decays. and the Maelstrom Pulse is also not going to be good enough.
The one Maelstrom Pulse, it's possible that, I mean, the only thing it can do is actually, is to get a Hive Mind, which, if at all possible, Bryan doesn't ever actually give him a chance to do. Won't just run out of Hive Mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's a corner case that Maelstrom Pulse would be useful, and as a one of, that's a corner case of a corner case. So I think we're taking out the 3 Abrupt Decays, we're taking out the Maelstrom Pulse, we're taking out the Life from the Loam, in all likelihood. And we can also have the option of taking out the Lightning Bolts, which
you
are
probably
just
can
going
shave
to
some number if you believe you have a better card to use. Now that said, Lightning Bolt is less dead than the other cards.
Yeah, and the same sort of goes for Grim Lavamancer and Scavenging Ooze. Those are just 1/1s and 2/2s in this matchup for the most part.
He also has 1 Null Rod in the sideboard. Obviously not a great card in the matchup, but it's somewhat live. It does stop Grim Monoliths.
Yeah, so it's not the sort of thing that I'm looking to bring in, but if I had 15 Abrupt Decays,
right,
I would bring
it would come in over a Lightning Bolt if he chose to board it in.
So I think you can. So you're definitely going to bring in the Inquisition of Kozilek. You're definitely going to bring in the 4 Pyroblasts that he has. You're going to bring in the 2 Durasses, and you can. I would consider bringing in the Surgical Extractions. It only blanks the Intuitions, but it's pretty good when they are forced to Intuition.
Right. The blank. Yeah, it only really Surgical. One of those. This isn't actually a graveyard deck. There's there's some utility of it where sometimes in conjunction with Thoughtseize you can actually start to strip cards from the deck that are relevant. That said, it's that effect of saying this 2-card combo with discard is typically not good enough to justify the slot. You'd rather that effect is not good enough to justify just playing the card. You'd rather just have another threat. So I would imagine he probably won't board in many Surgicals if at all.
Yeah. The Pyroblasts can be a little bit awkward in that they're not very good Cascades, but the rest of what we're boarding in is pretty good.
Right, so his Cascades do get watered down a little bit, but I think just the strength of Pyroblast in the matchup makes them, he shouldn't be as worried about that.
Yeah. And so for Bryan, one of the things about these combo decks is that you don't want to sideboard too much because you can't water down, your search and your combo. I'd imagine that his plan for this matchup, which he would have prepared for, is to simply bring in the 4 Leylines of Sanctity, because so much of the John plan for disrupting you is targeted discard.
Exactly. That said, cards he might board out. He might board out. Let's look at cards. Cards that he would board out. Then, so we're talking about. He does have to water down his combo a bit, as his whole main deck is devoted toward the combo.
So this is a place that he may just decide to board out the 4 Force of Wills.
Exactly.
You don't really want to be 2-for-1ing yourself to prevent a discard spell.
Yeah, Force of Will is, interestingly enough, one of those cards it's actually a fairly weak card, except when it's completely amazing.
Yeah. Force of Will is often in Legacy a card that you want to defend yourself from combo, and it's a fairish card there. It's usually pretty bad against other fair decks. If you're in a fair deck mirror of Stoneforge Mystic versus Blue-White Miracles or Bug or whatever, or the actual mirror, it tends not to be very good. But where it really shines is defending yourself, or is aggressively pushing through your combo against other people's disruption that is counterspell based. So it looks like Bryan, who's on the play, has kept his 7, but John has decided that he needs something more than was in his opening hand.
Right. So one of the interesting things about this matchup, of what I presume, is that post-board, it becomes... So pre-board, we had this thing where late game favored Bryan. John had to put on somewhat of a clock because if both players are allowed to draw enough cards, Bryan will eventually resolve a Hive Mind and Pact. Now that John has all this, has 4 Pyroblasts and has all this discard, I'm not sure that's still the case. I feel like in a certain sense Bryan has to become more of an aggro deck here.
The question of that is entirely dependent on whether Bryan has a Leyline in the opening hand. If he has an opening hand, then he's got an inevitability. If he doesn't, then he needs to combo before John can strip his hand and really punish him.
Right. So what that'll mean is, that'll affect, John's keeps. Can John keep, an all disruption hand? And provided there's no Leyline, John can probably get away with that post board.
Yeah. if I were John, I want something that has disruption, but I also want something with a clock.
Yeah, ideally you would have both, but I think the question would be whether or not you're.
Yeah. So we see a Gitaxian probe from Bryan Eleyet that shows us a Liliana the Veil, a Hymn to Torak, and a Deathrite Shaman, along with a Fetch Land, a Bayou, and a Taiga.
If you'd like to sign up, you can do so with Ricky over here at Side Events. He'll be happy to get you in.
So this is a pretty reasonable 6. It's got disruption.
It's excellent.
We've got some ramp, and the fact that we've got 2 pieces of disruption is pretty nice. Additionally, the Liliana gives John some outs to an Emrakul from Bryan from that plan B.
What I like about Liliana in the matchup is it's both disruption and, in a way, a win condition.
Yep. So we see that Bryan has kept in the forces. He's got a Show and Tell, he's got a Pact of Negation, and he does have the Hive Mind in addition to 3 lands. So this is a pretty ideal opener. He's just going to need to find some way to actually cast the Pact of Negation on his turn.
Right. He doesn't, and he draws a white Leyline on the as his first draw. Because he doesn't have an Ancient Tomb or a City of Traders, he's going to have to wait one more turn. Hymn to Torak could do a number on this hand.
Yeah, and there's a decent chance that Bryan actually chooses to force a Hymn and be in control of what he is discarding. Certainly, if the Leyline were a blue card, any blue card, he would force there.
Right.
But as it is, like he probably won't, because he would have to pitch one of his pieces for getting the combo out, and unless he gets very unlucky, that's going to be approximately the same damage that the Hymn is going to do.
So we see there John has boarded in Surgical Extractions, so while shuffling.
Okay.
So the option here is whether John would play for Liliana to be mana efficient or to play for Hymn to Torak. Well, I'm of the opinion I think that Hymn's the correct play here.
I agree. It's more disruptive.
With Hive Mind, you do have to worry about a turn 3 win, and most Hive Mind, if he does have a turn 3 win, Liliana very likely will not stop it.
Yeah. So Bryan immediately forces with the Pact Negation. I think his plan is probably to just Show and Tell the Hive Mind in next turn, which makes him immune to the future discard and lets him, as soon as he draws a Pact, be able to win the game on the spot.
So a fetch land drawn by Bryan, so while he still can, we will almost certainly see Bryan resolve a Hive Mind. Or resolve a Show and Tell and get a Hive Mind.
Yeah. He's going to think through, make sure that this is the play that makes sense. But given what he's seen of John's deck, I don't imagine him doing anything other than Show and Tell this turn.
So, players who we're going to see Bryan go ahead with that line and Show and Tell the Hive Mind into play. We don't know what John has actually drawn. So it might just be a land for him as Scavenging Ooze.
Yeah. So Scavenging Ooze in this matchup is a Grizzly Bear. It's a 2/2, and this is a card that you wish you could sideboard out. But if you don't have enough cards to bring in, and there are a lot of dead cards in John's deck, then you leave it in because it is a clock. But that's one
Grizzly
of the
Bear's
best.
not completely unplayable in the matchup. It attacks, which is pretty relevant.
And I guess it does give him the option of exiling cards that were intuition for. Although, given the fact that you have Surgical Extractions in your deck, you probably don't want to do that. Yeah. So now we're in a race to see whether Grizzly Bear plus Deathrite Shaman is able to kill Bryan faster than Bryan is able to find a way to search up a Pact.
Right, so Bryan does not actually have a castable spell in his hand, so were he to find a Pact of Negation, he's going to need one additional spell.
True, although a Pact of the Titan will immediately win him the game.
Right.
Well, actually, no, that's not true.
That's not true at all. John can pay for Pact of the Titan.
Currently he can't, but one land he will. Yes.
Yeah, with one more land will give John a fairly decent insurance policy there. And right on time. Bryan's going to play Pact of the Titan. Both players get a 4/4, and John is 1 land short of being able to pay for that.
And this is actually kind of an interesting point, going back to the show and tell we had last turn. One of the options John had, instead of putting his Scavenging Ooze into play, he could have chosen to put his land into play, hoping to draw another land on his turn in order to play around Bryan top decking a Pact of the Titan. That's like a very, very narrow corner case, and it's probably better to have the Grizzly Bear in play and get 2 extra damage in, increase the clock. But
that
it's an option that you have.
Yeah. Certainly, if John had something along the lines of a second Deathrite Shaman, or some way, because Deathrite Shaman makes any color mana, John can set up boards where he gets himself pretty immune to pacts.
Yeah, and I think the correct play for the pact, if he had 2 lands in hand, would have been to show and tell a land into play, certainly. Yeah. So we see Bryan explain to John exactly how the combo works and what's going to happen to him. And John says, yep, I've played Legacy for the past couple of years. I basically understand what's going on here. And we shuffle up for game 3. We'll see if John decides that he wants to change his sideboard at all. We see as he's shuffling that he did bring in the Pyroblasts, and we saw the Surgical Extractions. We haven't seen the Duresses yet, but they have to be in there.
Almost certainly would be in.
So he brought in all the cards that we thought he would. There's some question about what he took out and what he was able to leave in. I think he probably did basically what we thought.
The entire set of lightning bolts.
The 4 lightning bolts, the 3 abrupt decays, and the 1 Maelstrom Pulse to bring in those cards.
And the life from the loam.
And the life from the loam, and probably the Grim Lavamancer and shaved the Scavenging Ooze.
Something like that, yeah. Which would give him enough slots to bring in all the cards that we saw. One card I wanted to talk about, actually, in John's sideboard is Koth of the Hammer.
So that is a spicy one. I actually haven't seen that in Legacy yet, but it actually makes a lot of sense in this deck. For a while, when people were playing, back when people played Zoo, and then later when people played Maverick, one of the ways that you got advantage both in the mirror and against control decks was bringing in Planeswalkers. And so Elspeth Knight Errant was a card that you brought in those cases as a way to just completely trump your opponent's strategy, because it won the game by itself and it was very difficult to remove. There are not a lot of spells that are played in Legacy that deal with Planeswalkers. And so it makes sense that the Jund deck would be interested in doing something similar. And Koth is a 4-mana Planeswalker that is available in those colors that is a very, very scary threat.
So as far as, so what you'd be saying is, Koth is just, it's a threat, it's a harder to answer threat.
Yeah. I think it's the sort of card that you would want to bring in the mirror and probably against Blue-White Miracles. I don't know. It might be good against Esper Stoneblade. And a lot of these fairish decks, it's going to be good against, especially the ones that don't have lightning bolts in them. It's going to be very hard for them to deal with before it goes ultimate, and that's an ultimate that is pretty hard to beat. Most of the Planeswalker ultimates.
So essentially board it in against any deck that has trouble stopping him from making an emblem.
Decks that are going to have trouble stopping him from making an emblem. That's a good heuristic. I think a better heuristic is in games that you expect to go more than 6 turns, Koth is going to be a good thing to bring in.
Okay.
And I think that's true of most 4-mana Planeswalkers in this format.
Yeah, basically when you get a 3rd activation off a Planeswalker, that should be winning you the game or close to it.
Yeah. And especially if you're getting out on the 3rd turn, it's pretty exciting through Deathrite Shaman acceleration. So we've exchanged decks, we're shuffling up for game 3. John's going to be on the play. And looks like something interesting is happening on the other feature match. They're both looking over there. So we're passing back the decks, and we're going to be drawing our opening 7s in just a minute and seeing whether anybody wants to mulligan.
Right, so Bryan, we have John back on the play this game. There's a chance that once again, really the tone of the match here is going to be set by whether or not Bryan has the white ley line in his opener.
Yeah, it's it's the most important question. John also knows about the white ley lines because he saw one in that matchup.
Right.
And so, you would expect him to at least be thinking about that as he's sideboarding for game 3. So looking at his hand, it looks like he's got 2 dual lands and at least 1 fetch. May have 2 fetches. That looked like a pretty land-heavy hand for John. I didn't see any disruption, although sometimes it's a little difficult to see. So John has decided that that's not good enough for him. He's going to have to mulligan and go to 6. And it looks like Bryan may be faced with a similarly difficult decision here. He's going into the tank thinking about whether a mulligan. And I think that's a resign keep. So we'll see in a moment whether or not John Edwards is able to keep 6 or whether he's going to have to go further down to 5. I think this is a matchup where John, which is usually pretty good at mulliganing, is actually fairly disadvantaged by it. There are so many things that you need in your opening hand.
Right, you need both a clock and usually like 2 pieces of disruption in your opening hand to adequately fight a combo deck. And because of that, a 6-card hand to be able to have lands and all of those things really has to hit on all cylinders. It's likely whatever he keeps will be missing one of those things.
Yeah. So he does keep. There's a Duress in his hand. There's a Pyroblast in his hand.
And then
there's
all
a
land.
Thoughtseize and the rest
so
is land.
This white ley line is just brutal.
Yeah. Turn 0.
Right, so now John has kept a 4-card hand of 3 lands Pyroblast. This is going to be a very difficult game for him.
Yep.
So City of Traders, Grim Monolith. If Bryan has a hive mind, he can go for it next turn.
I don't believe he has an island in hand. He does have a hive mind, and he definitely does have at least 1, possibly 2 Pact of the Titans in his hand. He's in pretty good shape if all he's missing is an island here. Although we know that
there's a Pyroblast.
The Pyroblast is going to create problems. But so Bryan does pass without an island. You can see that he kept this hand on the strength of the ley line and the fact that he has
all these mana sources.
He has these mana sources and he has the combo in the hand. But unfortunately, he's not going to be able to start it off immediately. So John fetches for his second turn, and I presume that he has drawn something that he can play if he's fetching at this point.
Yeah, the fetch on, presumably he's doing that, or even at the very least he may just be fetching on the back of the fact that he feels land flooded.
Sure.
He just wants to actually get lands out of his deck. There's no danger in making that play in this matchup.
Yeah, given he's not a blue deck, so he doesn't have to wait worry about Brainstorm or anything like that. And he does draw a Deathrite Shaman for the turn, which is sort of a clock. It is going to be attacking for 1 at some point, and then eventually it'll be able to exile cards from graveyards and deal 2 a turn.
Well,
it targets the card.
Okay, doesn't target the player.
Yeah, it targets the card and it deals damage to each. Each
opponent loses 2 life. Okay, so Deathrite Shaman's life loss does get around a white ley line.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that the surgical extractions that John has in are also targeting cards in graveyards,
not players,
and therefore are not targeting players and are not dependent on the ley line.
But the big thing is that we are on turn 3 right now, and Bryan still is at 20 life, and because John doesn't have really almost any ways to disrupt right now, that's a very dangerous situation for him.
Yeah, and it's interesting how John could have mulliganed and found a threat-heavy hand, and this game would be going very differently. But instead, he found a disruption-heavy hand that ended up being very poor against Bryan.
So Liliana actually will also work as disruption. He can plus the Liliana all he wants. I don't believe he can't ultimate the Liliana.
He can ultimate targeting himself, I believe.
Right,
but that's not something he want to do. He also is not going to be able to deal with an Emrakul with the Liliana because that does target.
That targets a player. So he'll only have the +1 ability. Yeah. So he'll get to decide whether or not that's something he wants to do. And I feel like my guess would be until John's hand becomes more empty of cards, he may not actually want to do that. Because Bryan's hand is so full of, it's kind of full of things right now. Bryan disagrees. Bryan's willing to force a will.
Yeah. If I were Bryan, so Bryan is expert with this deck and has played this matchup much more than I am, so most of the time that I disagree with him, he's going to be right. If I were in his position, though, I would not force there. I would just discard the Ponder. I think, like, you're happy having John spend cards from his hand.
Right, so we're going to... All right, Bryan's going to go for his first attempt on Hive Mind, because we know this one's not, it's going to meet a Pyroblast.
Yeah, and presumably Bryan is actually going to show and tell for the Hive Mind here, which that he plays around the Pyroblast.
Right, because if it's countered, he wants the show and tell to be countered, not the actual Hive Mind to be countered.
Exactly.
That way will require 2 counter spells from John.
So it ends up being a bait spell.
Yep, fetch happening with City of Traders trigger on the stack.
Yeah. That said, you don't always expect a counterspell out of a non-blue deck, so it's possible Bryan overlooks that line and
goes straight
for the Hive Mind, wanting to save the show and tell for something else.
For a possible Emrakul.
Yeah.
No, but he's going to go for the show and tell.
Tight play. It gets Pyroblasted, and Bryan's like, yep, okay, that's why I did that. Passes the turn back. John presumably is going to exile something.
He could exile a land. That's it. He's used his mana, so there's no play available to him. So now John, unless he draws another Pyroblast of some sort, he's going to be dead next turn. Well, he actually, I should pause there. He can actually pay for Pact of the Titan right now.
He could pay for a Pact of the Titan.
So
there are 2 Pact of the Titans in Bryan's hand.
Okay, he can't pay for 2 Titans.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Bryan should, this should be the green light for Bryan.
Yeah. So Bryan is drawing an Intuition for the turn. He may be thinking about, do I Intuition to set up something a couple turns down with more protection? But that seems kind of out of line.
Right. So there's this Hive Mind, and Bryan's basically running into what would be a second Pyroblast.
Yeah.
If it were there, Bryan would almost certainly not be able to get back in the game because he'd be down to 1 land. And now the 2 Pact of Titans should be enough to get John.
Indeed. So we're seeing if John has any response to either of these. He's presumably not going to.
The second one's going to be pretty hard to pay for.
Yeah. Need a lot of Simian Spirit Guides to get through that.
All right, so Bryan Eleyet wins 2-1 over John Edwards. This advances to 4-0 on the day.
Yeah, a good start. And John Edwards still in contention. He's a regular Legacy player around here. He plays at Mugu Games in Everett. He also, you regularly see him at the Mox tournaments around here. He's been around for a while.